Welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. My name is Matthew, and today I'm joined by two great guests, Jess Plummer and Becky Allen, as we're discussing the TV show She-Ra. We're talking about why we love this show so much and what makes it so important. We're talking about a lot of the different characters and the arcs they go on, and we're asking, just how hard do you have to work in this universe to not get a redemption arc? All that and more after this commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. As I said, I'm Matthew, and I'm joined today by two great guests, people who have been really important parts of this podcast. They've both been guests before, and as I've mentioned a couple times, I got to hear both of them speak at a fantastic conference called WisCon, one that was supposed to be this coming weekend. It still is happening online, but for obvious reasons is not happening in person. And funny enough, I know the two of you are great friends. I've had each of you on numerous times. But this is the first time I've had you both on together, so it's great to have you both on to be talking about She-Ra today. How you guys doing today?
Pretty good. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this. It's the first time I think I've been on to talk about something other than Star Wars.
Very true.
But you know me, I love a show in space, so this is thematically this is fine.
Well, and also, I mean, kind of like Star Wars, it does bridge that, like, is it fantasy, is it sci-fi thing pretty well. And there is one particular shot that I think was a direct reference to Star Wars that we'll discuss. But obviously that won't be our main focus. And we're talking about the TV show She-Ra, which I have really loved. And the newest season just came out on Netflix. It felt to me like a final season. I don't know if that's official yet, but certainly that's how it felt to me. But either way, it's a great time to be talking about it. And I will say, at the top, for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, we will be spoiling everything that has happened on the TV show She-Ra so far, all 5 seasons. If you haven't seen it yet and you want to, definitely hit pause. This episode will be waiting for you until you finish the show. If you haven't seen it, I would greatly suggest taking a look at it. But if not, if you want to just hear people talk about it, and why we love it so much, and what are the questions it raises, kind of keep on listening. So let me just start with that. What's your kind of overall take on this show about why? I know both of you are really big fans. What do you like about this show, and what makes it one that you think of as important and just really good?
I mean, go for it.
So I grew up on Sailor Moon, which was my very first fandom when I was a middle schooler. And so I have always been a big fan of the magical girl genre, and specifically of at this group of girls who are friends and who are powerful and who can defeat the bad guys with love and kindness and caring towards one another. Mm-hmm. And that's what She-Ra is also, like all of those things. So it's very much like, for me, it feels like something that I grew up on, but is able to be much more blatantly about that, and much more blatantly queer. And I really enjoy what's at the core of the show, I think, and I also really enjoy the space/fantasy aesthetic, and I love all of the characters. So everything is what makes it good.
Yeah, it's a beautifully done show. It's brilliantly written. It's gorgeously animated. It's such a pleasure to experience, like, visually and auditorially. It's so rich. And yeah, everything that Becky said, I mean, it's sort of the original She-Ra show. It was created to sell toys, and is pandering in sort of the worst ways. Like, no offense to those who grew up on the original show, which is a little bit before my time, but it was sort of a soulless endeavor. And the thing about this show is it sort of takes the commercialization of media for little girls and turns it into a rich celebration of all the things that girls can be, and that people, that everybody can be, because certainly the show plays a lot with gender, But, even the idea of like, here's a bunch of princesses, but they're not just action figures. They're not just dolls. They're complex characters, and they draw their strength from being magical princesses. And like the body diversity on the show, the racial diversity, the gender and sexuality diversity, like it's just great. It's a good show.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah, I have a number of one thing I always bring to kind of, because I mean this is meant as a kids show, and one of the kind of rubrics that I always bring to those shows is this one that can both have, be very enjoyable to kids, and have, good messages for kids, but also that the parents aren't kind of like, gnashing at their teeth, glad their kids are watching something, but it's painful for them, I spent enough years babysitting people who watched Barney and Thomas the Tank Engine to have a lot of sympathy for that perspective.
Yep.
And it's interesting to me how many parents I know who absolutely love this show, both because they think it's great for their kids, but it's three things I think what I hear a lot is that it's great for the kids. They find it very entertaining as well. I mean, I think if I'm correct, none of the three of us have any kids, and we all love the show. But also that I've heard from so many parents that it leads to great conversations between kids and parents, because there's so many different ways to see yourself in the huge range of characters who, as you said, I think are diverse in so many different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, there are kids shows and there are all ages shows. And this is an all ages show, which is not the same. I mean, it's like a good Disney movie. Like anybody can watch Beauty and the Beast. That's not for children. It's for everyone. And I think that She-Ra is definitely among other shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender, or like really clever, smart shows that are not only entertaining to kids, but they take complex questions and they make them accessible to kids, but they don't dumb anything down. It's about making it understandable to everyone and not sort of underestimating an audience just because children are part of the audience.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Especially because for me, that the bar has always been set for me of the Muppet Show. One that, I could love so much as a kid and then go back as an adult and feel like I caught so much, but that at all ages, there was so much that I was gaining out of it. Now, very funny, but also some really good messages and things like that. And I like that description of all ages. I think it's a good way of talking about this. Well, and we talked about representation especially, and I don't want to get too far into this, because I know a lot of great writing has been done in other places, but especially as I've heard both of you talk about the frustration you sometimes have with the lack of diversity in characters, especially in issues of both gender and queerness. Talk a little bit about what it is about this show that makes it so different than everything else that's out there, and why that matters so much.
I mean, I think it's really telling that in season 4, they introduce a character who's voiced by Gina Davis, who literally has a whole, I think it's like a nonprofit. She has this whole endeavor to bring more gender diversity and better balance to children's media, and pointing out how, like, if you look at the top selling picture books, like the top 100.
You're talking about Gina Davis. For a minute, I thought you were talking about the character, and I was getting very confused. But yeah, okay, go on.
Yes, Gina Davis, the real human being,
Right.
who has talked about and has, like, literally they have done studies to show that if you look at, as I was saying, picture books or kids media, especially for preschoolers, it's like maybe 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 of the characters are female. And we're talking about, like, books about, like, living crayons or dump trucks or whatever. Like, they're not gendered objects, but they're all very clearly male.
Right.
And she appears on this show because this show is everything that she has been trying to fight for. I mean, I don't know what's going on in her head, but I'm assuming that, like, she was happy to be on the show because this is something that she feels really strongly about. And the thing about She-Ra that's really striking, like, not only are almost all, there's like 2 major male characters, 3 if you count Hordak or Horde Prime, like, they're almost all the main characters are female. But when you look at the crowd scenes, or when they have like a one-off, like, just like a random thug that they have to get past to get into somewhere, or even characters are female when there is no reason for them to be female except for the fact that women exist.
Right. It's exploding the whole idea of male as the default and, oh, this character should be a woman, so it's not the default.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that female is the default for this show, and you have to make a really solid case for a character to be male. And this show also has characters who are neither of those things, which is incredible.
Yeah, so how much do you want to hear about my gender?
I think as much as you want to disclose, you're utterly welcome to do so. I'm going to be talking, at a later point in the show, I'm going to be talking quite a lot about my own mental illness, because it's very relevant. So whatever you want to talk about, go for it.
So I am non-binary, and I am somebody who has been coming to that realization, like it was sort of a long time coming thing, and then in the last year and a half or so, it became much clearer to me. So in the first season of She-Ra, there is an episode called Princess Prom, which is amazing. Yep. And one thing that really struck me about it, that may or may not have made me cry a little to myself, is that Catra, who is one of the show's antagonists, and we're going to talk so much about her, she's not a princess, but she's there with a princess, shows up wearing a really rad suit. And like, there's nothing in the show that ever states or assumes that Catra is anything other than female or identifies as anything other than female. But as somebody who was, assigned female at birth, I'm fine with she, her pronouns. I'm fine with they, them pronouns. But even so, seeing somebody who is read as female, who shows up in this all ages show wearing a suit, looking dapper as hell, and that's just an okay way to be. And it's like, yeah, of course that's what she would wear. That completely suits her personality and everything we know about how she views herself. That was the first time I kind of felt permission to start presenting myself in a way that was less female coded. And, like, I've never been particularly femme. Like, that's, it's not like I was like, oh, I can stop wearing dresses, because I had never really worn dresses. But it was the first time I started thinking, like, oh, I could buy a suit. Seeing it was so important and meaningful to me. And I say that as an adult human who has, had a long time to process gender and come to terms with gender and figure out who I am and who I want to be. And it still struck me as something that was incredible and powerful and very important to me. And I literally have a picture of Catra that actually Jess got for me in her suit hanging up on my wall above my desk. So, like, it's something which, just in terms of sheer representation, and things we don't see that much of in any media, but in this case particularly media that is all ages but considered strongly to be for children. It was incredibly powerful and meaningful to me. So yeah. I think, and I am not the only person who's going to come to this show and have an experience like that, because it is such an inclusive cast, and they do have such a variety of different body shapes and different skin tones and different personalities and different gender presentations and different sexualities. Like, there's so much there that I feel like it's a show where a lot of people of all ages can come to it and have a sudden feeling of, oh, this is reflecting something within me that is important. And that makes it a really important show.
And I love that you specifically brought that up, because I'll admit, and granted, this is a much smaller character, but for myself, as I identify as somewhere in a male, demi-male, non-binary sense myself, and I had kind of a similar moment with the character of Seahawk, who is also very male-presenting, also seems to be wearing makeup quite often, and is certainly very happy-looking, pretty fabulous. I mean, the degree, especially in this last season, I kept noticing the degree of grooming that he had for his facial hair, for example, or just things of his look that were... The character is played as very traditionally male, and I remember when he first came on, I was a little like, okay, is this going to be the stand-in for, like, why, I had a little bit of a worry of like, is a show that's going to be so much about women power going to be introduce this male figure who's a laughable male buffoon to be exactly that? And the fact that he is a laughable buffoon, but in a way that you're supposed to love him, not that he's a representation of toxic masculinity. That character was really important to me, and especially and just the fact that he is both clearly very heterosexual, or at least, I mean, may well be very queer. Yeah,
is anybody on the show very heterosexual?
Yeah, no, I said that immediately. I was like, no, that's not what I mean. He is very attracted to Mermista. Yes. I think he's also very attracted to everything and everyone in the show. But just his presentation really spoke to me in a similar way, and I think really hit me in a kind of similar way. So I love hearing you talk about that.
Yeah, Seahawk, I get the feel, like, obviously he's in love with Mermista, which I was like, really? When I first encountered him, because he also seems to be interested in Beau, and also every single time he runs into a male character, they're clearly his ex. But, you know, you date someone, you set their boat on fire. But
I love Seahawk.
I love him so much, but that's the thing about the show, like, I don't want to be sitting here saying, like, oh, yes, and this is sufficient representation, or this is enough, but, like, the show almost never puts a label on anyone or anything.
Yeah.
While making it still very clear that there is space within these characters and within this world for queerness and for non-traditional expressions of gender and sexuality, and that I think all of the characters are open to various readings, and that seems to me to be a deliberate choice on the parts of the creators, but not in a like, well, we don't want to put a label on it kind of way, but in a, we want everybody to be able to see themselves. And so, like, I've seen people saying, like, is Beau a trans guy or is he cis? And we don't know, and it's not important that we know. It's important that he is presented as this wonderful character who, as you were saying, like, absolutely not toxic masculinity, that he is who he is, and that both of those readings are available for the people who need to see them.
Yeah. I think it's a very good point. Oh, go ahead, Becky.
I was just going to say they do so little labeling that in the 5th season, I was actually very surprised that they had Natasha and Spinnerella explicitly refer to themselves as, like, this is my wife. We are married, because even among the presumably heterosexual parents from Glimmers, Beau does not have heterosexual parents. I don't remember them saying, like, married as the way, and, like, you can assume that they are, but it's not something that is really called out as here is our specific relationship. Right. And I think that that's great because it leaves a lot of room, but I'm also very glad that they did in the 5th season. They were like, yeah, these two background characters who've been hanging around as minor characters since the beginning, they're married. And that's good.
Surprised that they were old enough, because everybody looks 14 to me on this show, but it's fine.
Yeah, I wondered about that, but I did like the way they called that out. I will say, I don't know if you're quite of the same generational reference, but as someone who grew up with Salt and Pepper being a big part of my musical life, I couldn't hear that character's name without hearing Spinderella spin it up one time. I know it's Spinnerella, not Spinderella, but that was hard.
No, I'm a little younger than you are, but I had the exact same reaction. I don't know the music as well, but I definitely always refer to her as Spinderella by accident.
Yeah.
But Shoop is one of my karaoke jams, so.
There you go. I will say, though, I definitely get your saying, especially because, and I think when we get into more of the characters, we'll do more of this. One of the things that I've really felt, a place where I really connected with some of the characters, and I know I've heard from a lot of others who felt the same, is in regard to mental illness and neurodiversity. And there again, there's no label that's given. Like, I don't think it's fair to say, you know, Entrapta is autistic or that some other character is this or that. But I certainly know I've read a lot of great pieces from folks who are autistic saying how much they identify with Entrapta. You know, I I myself am someone who has what's referred to as cluster 2 symptoms, which is basically a mixture of borderline and PTSD. And I completely identified with Catra in a lot of ways, and I've been reading a lot of great pieces in some of the support groups I'm in about how people who say, like, it's totally irresponsible to try to diagnose another real person, let alone a character, but that we can see so many of those features in this character. And the way that they're able to do that, I think very intentionally, like, someone who really understands trauma was writing these characters and like thinking about how would this affect Catra, how would this affect Adora and stuff like that. But they do that without trying to put a label on it of one kind or another. And I just think that's such a good way to do representation, because it doesn't say this person's in the same box as I am. It says I see myself in this character. Yeah,
absolutely.
So, and let's just talk more about let's actually use that as kind of a chance to dive into some of the specific characters. I know Catra we're going to want to talk about for quite a bit. Let's start with actually just the hero of the show, Adora, She-Ra. What's your kind of feelings about her character and her character arc and the decisions she has to make?
She is a good character and she should feel good. So I like Adora a lot, and I think she's a really interesting character because there is, throughout a lot of the show, an expectation of sacrifice, including right up through the finale. It's always like Adora has to be, as She-Ra, she has to be willing to sacrifice herself to save everyone else. And I think Jess actually had wanted to talk a little about that. But I do think that the way the show presents that as not always being a good thing is something that I have rarely seen. Because we are a culture that loves our stories about selfless heroes who are willing to die for their cause, and I think that is an understandable and often good story and an important thing, but also saying, hey, maybe you don't have to give everything to your cause. Maybe it's okay if you want to survive. I think that is also a really important thing, and that Adora is a character where that is really explored in ways that I have not often seen.
Yeah, I did want to talk about that. I think it's a really key part of her character, and I think it is something that we do expect of people, but it's something specifically that we expect of women. Constantly sacrificing yourself, constantly giving everything you have. And like, look, I'm not going to lie. I grew up in this culture too, and I don't think it would have fit the tone of this show, but I can see myself watching a show where the heroine does in fact basically burn up, carrying the weight of First One's code or whatever to destroy this weapon and save everybody she loves, and like being really moved by that and being like, that was such a good and sad show.
I feel like we did see that show, season 5 of Buffy.
Yeah, no, we definitely did. We've seen it many times, and I think it also would have been particularly inappropriate in this case because of the increasingly obvious, not that it wasn't obvious from the first episode, but the increasingly obvious love story between Adora and Catra. This was not a team that was going to kill off its queer characters. Like, that was not going to happen. And this, love story between two women with a dying sacrifice. But the fact that Mara tells Adora that she's allowed to want things and she's more than what she can sacrifice for others. And speaking as somebody who did sacrifice everything for others.
Yeah.
I'm meaning Mara, not myself. And the fact that there's one episode where all Bo is trying to do is get Adora to sleep because she needs to. And the idea that not just that you're allowed to take the time for yourself, that you're allowed to sleep, that you're allowed to want things that are just for yourself and that are not big epic things that will save everyone, not only does the show say that Adora is allowed to have these things, but it makes it explicit that these are the things that give her strength. She is better at being She-Ra if she has gone to sleep. She is able to save the world because she loves her one person who she wants to be with and get to wear a nice outfit and go to a party with. Like, those little things, God. That, like, vision that she has, oh my God, like, and the fact that Catra's jacket matches Adora's dress, like, oh, those things are her strength and not necessarily, or not solely her willingness to die for everybody else. And that's a really important thing to tell girls and everybody.
And that's why I brought up Buffy, actually, because I admit someone who has watched Buffy quite a lot. I am in many ways a very big fan and also very aware of how poorly it's aged and being able to see a lot more of the problematic parts to it. And this, honestly, I think is one of the biggest. It may well be that it's just a part of the cultural zeitgeist, but I don't think it happened, but I wouldn't be shocked if the writers, in some extent, were thinking a little bit about Buffy, because especially in this last season, especially all the discussion about Adora not having wanted to become She-Ra, the idea, I think we get this more in the last 2 seasons, but that, this council had created the She-Ra to make some girl be that, to fight what they saw as the great evil, and her, like, there were so many things that gave me Buffy connections. And so for her to, so drastically not go the direction that Buffy had to go, to me, it hit me as very significant because as you said, it's not, the traditional story is the sacrifice, especially of the queer character, especially of the woman character.
Yeah, in my experience, millennial women who are writing stories with queer women in them almost always were very influenced by Buffy. So I think that's a safe guess.
Yeah, I can see that as being, and I can, to some extent, it's unfair if that's the all thing everyone compares to, but yeah, I can see that it was a seminal work at the time. Just kind of continuing on that, I've always said that as someone who loves Buffy, Buffy is my least favorite character in that, because she feels a little bit like she doesn't have as much development as some of the others, and I really love that Adora feels much more of a real character to me. I'm not even comparing it to Buffy, because many others may see in her stuff that I didn't, but the fact that she is very much the hero, she's very much the thing the show is built around, and yet a lot of her flaws come out as well. I mean, no more than any others, but the fact that she, like you said, she has that desire to sacrifice herself, that, her and Catra obviously have this long history from childhood, and a lot of it seems to be fears that Catra is projecting onto her, but that there is some truth to it, and in some of the ways that Adora treats Catra and the back and forth and stuff. And she felt to me like a much more human character than I often see from the sort of superheroine type role that you get, where it seems like the point is to be like the most powerful character anyone can imagine without there being much there.
Yeah, she's not an every girl. She is very specific. I don't think she's as complex as Catra or even Glimmer, but certainly she's at the same level as like Bo.
Yeah. Also, it's a small thing, but I know in the first when it first came out, there was some controversy, is a dumb word, because mostly dumb people on the internet being dumb, but there were people who were upset that she was wearing shorts under the skirt and her outfit wasn't as ridiculously sexualized. But she still had the incredibly long flowing hair and the short skirt. And I don't know if maybe I made more of it than it needed, but to me it felt really significant that by the 5th season, when she kind of was reborn as She-Ra, now she was in pants and her hair was tied back. It was a small detail, but it seemed like the kind of thing that, like so much in the show, was a very intentional part of that evolution of leaving behind the idea that she has to be the sexualized figure.
Well, apparently her new She-Ra outfit, after the sword is broken, is very specific to the best friend squad, because her little headpiece matches the shape of Catra's, and she's got a heart on her chest to match Bo's heart boots, and I forget what the Glimmer thing was, but
oh, that's fantastic.
Her friendship was literally built into, her friendship with the 3 most important people to her was literally built into her magical manifestation of messianic power, which is Ugh.
We're gonna talk a little about the first ones later, but it's also like, hey, I've broken free of the thing that I was told that this She-Ra, but like that this persona is, or that it was supposed to be as defined by these other people, and now it is the thing I make myself, and that what she makes for herself is based on how much she loves people and the importance of those friendships. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Also, just like, I go to a lot of comic book conventions for fun and also because it's part of my job, and I see so many little girls dressed as She-Ra in this modern costume, and like, I do not care what any adult man crying about how She-Ra isn't sexy enough thinks at any time or ever, but especially when I see how joyful these little girls with their ratty wigs and enormous cardboard swords are. Like, they're having the best time. So anybody else can just go to hell.
I think it's so true. And just one other kind of little detail like that I picked up on, and this may be because I was watching a lot of it at between like midnight and 4 a.m. And so I was kind of like focusing on small things. The opening song is obviously fantastic, and the visuals behind it are great. And maybe they've been doing this the whole time, but in the last season, every episode they changed who was where, and that as more characters started coming over to the princess's side, they started appearing on the princess, like when it was all lined up, instead of like with the villains in the initial shots that had been.
And then they left, like when Mermista and Scorpia and them were captured, they or chipped, they disappeared from that like final shot, and also the footage, you know, the live action footage, the bit in the theme song where Adora and Catra are fighting changed to like them fighting and then them stopping and smiling at each other, and it's so good.
Well, part of what got me thinking about it was I was watching it at one point with one of my partners, and we were thinking about the song and how at this point both of our favorite character was for both of us, our favorite characters were Catra and Scorpia. And the song is all about we're going to win in the end. And we're sort of thinking, like, what does that song mean since we love characters on both sides of this fight? And I kind of love that they wound up bringing that home because by the end, they're all on the same side. Except the only person without a redemption, Hordak Prime. Okay, well, we keep dancing around how we have so much we want to say about Catra, so let's just go ahead and talk about Catra. She's my favorite character. I get the sense that you guys also are really big fans. What's your take on Catra, especially the fact that she gets a pretty crazy redemption arc of a kind we haven't seen very often? Let's just talk about Catra. What do you got to say?
I have so much to say.
I know, we're now going to start a 5-part series on Catra.
Are you sure? Because I could do that.
I know.
So I think that Catra is the most complicated and interesting character on the show. I think her redemption arc is amazing. As a viewer, it is like watching the first season. It was really interesting to watch how she and Adora related to each other and how she became increasingly angry at Adora, and then seeing her go deeper and deeper into a very dark and bad place and do a lot of things that are extremely bad and like world-shatteringly bad. And then see them bring her back from that is not only just a really good arc in and of itself and like an incredible feat of writing and characterization, but I also can't think of a single other female character who was allowed to have that kind of descent into being a genuine villain and doing genuinely bad things and then come back and be redeemed and not die. And like there may be other characters out there who I'm not familiar with or I'm not thinking of, but like seeing that in a female character is so unusual and rare and interesting, and I loved it and am so glad that they were able to do that.
Yeah, I was trying to think of other female characters who have gone that dark and were redeemed without dying, and the only one that came even close was Raven from Teen Titans, but like in the comics, because she doesn't go so dark in the cartoon, and I haven't seen the live action show, but she when she goes that dark, it's because she's being controlled by other forces. And the other thing about Catra is that she has full agency at all times. All of her choices are hers, whether they're good or bad, which is also incredible. Like, I mean, she's a cat. She's not going to do what anybody else tells her to do ever.
Yeah.
And that is always true about her. She's been compared a lot to Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, who also had an incredible redemption arc, and I do think that they are similar types of characters in a lot of ways. Not that similar as people, but just enough alike that they would hate each other.
Oh, like,
yeah. So much. But I mean, like, once Catra joined the best friend squad at the end in the second half of the last season, I was like, time for life-changing field trips with Zuko.
So true.
But with both
the moment when
go ahead.
The moment when Natasha is naming everyone's weakness, and then his Catra's like, you don't know mine, and then she just squirts her with a spray bottle.
It's so good. Yeah. But yeah, like both of those characters, when you're introduced to them, you know that these are antagonists who will be redeemed by the end. It's very clear, and yet what's interesting is not where will they end up, but how will they get there. And especially in Catra's case, like you were saying, Becky, she shatters the world. We talked about this when I got to that episode, because I was a little bit behind and had to catch up on 3 seasons in 6 days, and it's fine, and I'm not tired at all. But when I got to the episode where she pulls the lever and opens the portal, and I was like, how are they going to bring her back? And you just looked at me like, you hate spoilers, so stop looking at me. But I really couldn't see how they would do it, but I knew they had to, and they did it, and they pulled it off, and it was great.
Yeah, a couple of things there. I can only think of one character who, a female character who went that dark and got to come back, and it was a storyline that was handled much clumsier, and it's Dark Willow, again from Buffy. And that one I think has all sorts of, I mean, it's, the death of a queer character that sends her over the edge, and for her, it's sort of like she has got one major break that makes her do one terrible thing, and then she comes back, as opposed to, a 5-season arc. So I don't put them in the same category, but that's the only one I can think of that's at all close. But yeah, in terms of Catra especially, I remember when I watched The Princess Prom, I knew nothing about this show going in, and so I didn't know what to expect, and I didn't know if Catra was going to become a real antagonist, or if she was going to become, part of the Princess Squad pretty early. And I was convinced that she was going to flip over during the Princess Prom. And I remember being very surprised that we ended season 1 with her still being an antagonist, and thinking okay, I don't know what this show is supposed to be anymore. And I even didn't think she was definitely going to have a redemption. And for me, I think what makes her redemption so powerful, she is a character I would describe as amoral instead of immoral, or at least not even amoral. It's more, she has a very strong morality, but, and Jessica, you sent me a really good article about this that I'll put in the show notes that does a really good job talking about this. Her morality is entirely focused around her people, and it's not that she has a, mustache twirly, I want to destroy the world. It's that for her, what matters is protecting her people, and thus the incredible feeling of rejection she has. And that whole scene where she's destroying the world, she has this incredible confrontation with Adora about how Adora's going to stop it. And in her mind, this is Adora once again ruining things for Catra, once again, taking away something Catra wanted, when the whole time is that the one thing Catra most wants is Adora, and is Adora's affection and approval, and just companionship, and love. And there were so many scenes with Catra where you both have heard me talk about how my favorite character in any kind of media is the believable villain, the villain where I feel like if I was in their shoes, I could understand why what they were doing would seem like the right thing, even if I could disagree with that. And I don't think I've ever had that more than I do with a character than I do with Catra, because just everything she does once you really understand the childhood she had, and once you understand the way she has fixated Adora and fixated on the fact that everybody leaves her and everyone abandons her, it just made her so incredibly relatable and believable.
Yeah, I think that is honestly one of the most amazing things about Catra, is that even though she is doing genuinely terrible things, and you would understand if people were not able to forgive her, she never stops being relatable, because everything she does is motivated by what we know about her and her relationship to Adora and her childhood, and basically the way Adora is absolutely under her skin as somebody who she loves and wants to love her back, but also somebody she is forced into competition with and who wins, and so she feels like she needs to prove herself and she needs to be better than Adora, or that she is better than Adora and nobody else is recognizing it, and that constant frustration she has of both wanting to love Adora and to beat Adora, and then when Adora leaves, she really loses her only grounding, especially because Adora leaves and she is not then immediately hailed as successful, and Shadow Weaver still is horrible to her, and Hordak still doesn't care about her, and all of that, and so she has to figure out, what do I do with my ambition has always been to be with Adora and to be better than Adora, and now what do I do that both of those things are gone? And so I think that everything she does is so well motivated and so interesting and so believable that even though does terrible things, she opens a portal, she almost destroys the world, you still 100% empathize with her, because even though these are not good choices and they are not choices that somebody should make, you absolutely get why she does it. You have had a friend like that who you cared about more than they cared about you. You have had a rival who you really wanted to beat and never could. It feels very human and relatable, and I think they just did a stunningly good job with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also, Matthew, the point that you brought up about Catra's morality and her moral framework being very personal, and it's very much about sort of an eye for an eye and loyalty, but a very weird kind of loyalty where she's loyal to the idea of the Horde and wants Adora to be loyal to her, but she's not actually loyal to any particular anything else. She throws Entrapta and Scorpia under the bus. She undermines Shadow Weaver. She undermines Hordak. If she sees an opportunity, she will take it, and it doesn't matter who she stabs in the back to get there, because in her head, she has stayed true to something, and so she's right. But I think that the idea that her morality is it's so personal, and it is so much about interpersonal relationships, and she does not care about the world as a whole, is a really interesting balance to Adora, who sees ethics, and her ethical framework is about the world as a whole. And we talked about the idea of her sacrificing herself for the world and not so much for her interpersonal relationships. And it is only when those two things are balanced that they can have a happy ending, overall, and defeat Horde Prime, but also that they can be together.
Right.
But I also think that Catra's big moment of redemption is when she saves Glimmer. And even that has nothing to do with saving the world. Glimmer tells her to do one good thing, and her choice for that one good thing is to give Adora back the best friend who replaced her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
sorry. I was just overwhelmed by my feelings.
Yeah. No, I'm. It got dusty in here. Yeah, I mean, the scene where Glimmer and Catra bond over their shared love of Adora, in that kind of isn't it silly when Adora does this kind of thing? That scene was so beautiful and so heartbreaking, because it was Catra realizing she can connect with this other person on this kind of a level, but it's still being so centered around Adora.
The whole time period where Glimmer and Catra are both prisoners, but only Glimmer is officially a prisoner.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Like everything
so
about
good.
that. I was like, please give me 400 episodes of just the two of them. This is fascinating. Especially because Glimmer, and like I know we're still on the Catra train right now, but Glimmer has also made some choices at that point.
I want to talk about those too.
Yeah.
For me, one of the best Catra scenes or decisions that really drives home how you absolutely understand these decisions is, I think, in the third season when they've been in the Crimson Waste, and she's actually been really victorious in the Crimson Waste, and she has beat up all these goons, and she has taken over, and she's like found a place where she really fits in and where she is respected, and she's getting all of the positive feedback she never has before, and it's so clear that she likes it, and she's so close to just deciding to forget about the Horde and stay, and then she finds out that Shadow Weaver has gone back to Adora, and she throws it all away because she can't walk away from that hatred/love of Adora and that need to get that validation that specifically Adora has.
And Shadow Weaver too.
Yeah, I think what's really important there is the triangulation of those three. It's that because so much of the abuse that Catra goes through is Shadow Weaver constantly playing the two of them off against each other and saying, like, Catra, why can't you be more like Adora?
Yeah, so I think that that's such a good and interesting scene, and it happens about halfway through the series, which is really, and it's really when Catra starts her sly, well, she's been an antagonist the whole time, but it's when she starts making the worst decisions and the most untake-backable decisions.
Right.
And it goes from, oh yeah, she's an antagonist, to like, no, Catra, please, no, Catra, stop, oh no, honey! Like, I think that was such a really well done moment and such a good pivotal turning point for her, as you see and understand that she cannot walk away from this because she is so invested, and she has to be, because this was her childhood, this was her abuser and her friend who sometimes saved her from abuse but sometimes not so much, and that's a really complicated, messy relationship.
I want to talk about my own kind of connection to Catra in a moment, but first, you folks made an interesting point that made me think of something we were talking about before. Because we had this long conversation about sacrifice and how sacrifice is very often female coded. And that's an area where, as Jess, I think you were just saying, Catra and Adora are 100% different. Like, Catra does not have that sacrifice aspect to her at all. And Becky, you were before talking about like the ways in which Catra seems to break some like gender norms. Am I reading too much into it to think that those two are connected in some way? Or is that just kind of like an interesting coincidence, do you think?
I am not sure. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I do think it's interesting that it's Adora needs to learn to stop sacrificing herself and that she can have something for herself and want things. And Catra has to learn to be more sacrificing. She decides to... she sacrifices herself for Glimmer. She has no sense that Adora will really come save her. She, doesn't actually expect to survive this, and she does it anyway, so she will have done the one good thing, and that's when Adora is like, nope, gotta go save the cat, gotta go save Catra, and Glimmer is like, yeah, basically, we do. And I think that is an interesting way that they are like inverse from each other, but I'm not sure about gender within that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have, if you look at Catra in the tradition of female villains, certainly you have many, many female villains who are not at all interested in sacrificing themselves for anyone or anything. And the character, I mean, we do have a female villain, really, in this show who does sacrifice herself. And it's Shadow Weaver, who I also really want to talk about her.
We definitely will.
The other thing about Catra's redemption arc that I think is really interesting, and a lot of, really all of the redemption arcs that we see, there's a lot of discourse online about redemption arcs, and I think it was particularly sparked by the most recent Star Wars trilogy and Kylo Ren, and like, was Ben Solo redeemed? Did he deserve to be redeemed? What makes a redemption arc? He's no Zuko, your fave could never, etc.
Right.
And a lot of people, I've seen a lot of people arguing you cannot be redeemed until you have suffered. And you have to show a character suffering, because we're not going to like them. We're not going to forgive them. We're not going to be on board with them until we've seen them suffering. And then I saw a post. I mean, this was on Tumblr. I'm never going to be able to find it again. Apologies to the person who wrote this, because they made a great point that really made me rethink how I think about redemption arcs and suffering for characters. But they said that's a Christian way of looking at things. That is an entirely Christian mindset. And they were speaking from a Jewish perspective, and I am also Jewish. They said, essentially, the idea that you need to suffer to be redeemed is a Christian idea. In Judaism, redemption comes from atonement. And atonement is not suffering. Atonement is making up for the things that you did. It is doing good works to offset the bad works. And obviously, like, that reduces the idea to a binary. There are many other religions. I do not know enough about them to speak to how they engage with the idea of redemption. But the thing about Zuko, as like sort of the classic here, is that we don't like him because he suffers. We like him because he works really hard to fix what he did wrong.
Yeah.
And with the characters who are redeemed in this show, like Catra, of course, but also to a lesser extent in Entrapta and Scorpia, and Hordak, and even Shadow Weaver, they're not redeemed by suffering. They're redeemed because they make better choices and because they try to do the right thing. And it is, in fact, suffering just makes them worse. Mm-hmm. Like, the more you hurt Catra, the more she'll hurt you back.
Yeah. And
I'm really glad, because when she was captured by Horde Prime, I was like, oh, I really hope that this doesn't go down that... Like, I had that post from Tumblr in my mind, and I was like, I do not want to see Catra suffer, because it looked really bad for her. I was I don't want to see her suffer at length so that she's allowed to be with Adora at the end, and that's not what the show did, and I'm so grateful that that's not what the show did, and it allowed her to make good choices in a way that was still very much who she is.
So I said at the beginning that I identified with her in part because of mental perspective, and that, again, I don't want to diagnose anyone. I think she acts in ways that I, as a person with something very similar to borderline personality disorder, can very much relate to. And I'm going to link again. There have been some great pieces by people who also have borderline talking about all the ways in which they relate to Catra. And for me, that really started during the time when she's still part of, Hordak and all of his plans, or if she's taken kind of over from him. But she's starting to realize the damage that she's done, and she's feeling incredibly guilty about it. And she's caught in this downward spiral of guilt leading to self-hate, and self-hate leading to want to kind of lash out at others, and that just leading to doing more terrible things. And so to me, that's such a perfect example of like, no, her suffering is not in any way redemptive. Her suffering is the bad cycle that has to be broken. And it connected for me there, and especially because what we then get pretty soon afterwards is some more scenes of, some are flashback and some are just scenes between her and Scorpia and things like that, where Catra seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding or a misreading of what's happening. Adora goes off to join the rebellion because she thinks the Horde is wrong, and she very much wants Catra to join her, but Catra sees that as her being abandoned. And as children, Adora makes this new friendship with Lonnie and wants Catra to be a part of that. And Catra sees that as her choosing one over the other. And there's a number of times where Catra makes those kind of decisions that I think for many folks must be kind of, and I think Adora shows this, kind of like hair pulling out, frustrating, of like, clearly that's not what's happening. But the lens that she brings is one that, I mean, I can very much relate to. That I certainly know I brought that lens to a lot of things before I was able to kind of go through treatment, all that kind of thing. And that's, that specific detail is one that I've heard a lot of other people comment on, is really makes sense coming out of the background that she has. And so for me, I think so much her redemption arc is her being able to see those things again. Being able to see, like, that Glimmer can be upset at her, but still love her and still want to help her. That there can be recognition of the things she did bad, but it not be abandonment of her. It not be about her in that kind of way. And I think where I felt that the most is the fact that when she does come over to the princesses, it's not everything is now better. You actually have like a 3 or 4 episode arc of, where she's still really kind of prickly and she's still not sure she fits in and she's not sure that she's okay. It's not just Adora came and rescued me and so now everything's better, but instead it's, she's still figuring out where does she fit. And I feel like so much of that is her trying to, when I say the voices in her head, I don't mean that in a kind of a schizophrenic way. I mean it just in kind of like the self-doubt kind of idea of voices. She's having to really rewrite her mental scripts because she has had this mental script for so long of everyone will leave me, everyone will abandon me, everyone will always favor Adora, and Adora will always choose someone instead of me. And instead of it being an instantaneous thing, not like, okay, you're identified, you're cured, but that she really has to struggle to come back and to fight her way through that. And so because of that, I just found that so relatable. And I think the only time I've ever seen that particular kind of mental situation portrayed that way in anything, TV, movies, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about the voice in her head, it's Shadow Weaver's voice.
Yeah.
Like, not to say, like, that's the only reason that Catra is, shall we say, does not always deal with things in a healthy manner, but she's a major part of it.
Oh, yeah. And one of the things that I know that is not proof, but that is often a factor in people who have borderline or issues like that, is having a parent who clearly favored another child over you. And so, it's every aspect of this show feels to me like they didn't say, I read one article about this, let me write a character about it. They really did the research to say, like, okay, let's envision who a character like Entrapta is. What kind of choices would she make with Catra, with so many of these characters?
Yeah, no, I think it's incredibly powerful. I also, one thing that I think is really interesting is in one of the first episodes, it might actually be the first episode, Adora has just realized that the Horde is bad and that Shadow Weaver is bad, and she tells Catra, she's like, Catra, she's been messing with our minds, and Catra's like, yeah, duh, that's like her whole thing. Because Catra, as the one who was not favored, as the one who has borne the brunt of so much abuse, has in some ways a clearer look at what's going on, but because of those same factors does not have the pull towards a good or bad morality the way Adora does. She doesn't say, oh, because of what Shadow Weaver, because the Horde is bad, that means I should go do something else that's better. She only has, because Adora is gone, I need to get Adora back.
Right.
I think she just assumes that everything is bad all the time. Like, she has no expectation that things could be good or better. And one thing I noticed in the second half of the last season that was really painful to watch in a good way was anytime anyone is even a little bit nice to Catra, she gets this really surprised look on her face.
Yeah.
It's this sad little kitty.
Well, and what's beautiful about that is because that's actually healing, because before, when someone would do nice something, it wasn't surprise, it was immediate rejection. Scorpio would be nice to her, and Entrapta would be nice to her. She just would, Kyle or one of my favorite characters, the lizard person who's named Rogelio. I love Rogelio so much. But yeah, it used to be that anytime they're nice to her, she just rejects it. And so you're right, that's such a nice change when she starts to be surprised by it because she's allowing herself to just not immediately reject it.
I love Kyle. Sorry, you mentioned him and I was like, oh, Kyle.
One of the few things about the show that I didn't love was the everybody being mean to Kyle all the time. It was like, he's trying!
But they gave him a whole episode.
Yeah, the episode where he rescues them. Oh, it's so good.
Well, he eventually they that was eventually addressed, and I was very glad because it had been kind of a running gag that I hadn't loved, and then they were like, also they care about him and he's good, and I was like, okay, good.
Yeah.
One of my favorite jokes is when he was like, remember when you guys made Adora a cake with my ration bars? And they're like, that didn't happen. That was in the weird dream sequence. I was like, how do they know that?
That was so good. But yeah, let's talk about a character who gets a little more screen time. Let's talk about Shadow Weaver next, just because we're on this redemption arc story. Actually, one thing I wanted to just say, just back up, just an interesting point. It's funny that with all the talk about redemption, we never actually mentioned the fact that in some ways the entire show is also Adora's redemption arc.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, I think it's because so much of that appears off screen. But anyway, yeah. So Shadow Weaver. Where do we go with that character?
Man, fuck Shadow Weaver.
Fuck Shadow Weaver, but also, you know who she is a better version of? Snape. Like,
yeah.
Fair.
She is what should have happened with Snape and didn't.
Yeah.
You mean because she didn't have a huge crush on Catra's mother or father, and that's what motivated her the whole time?
Yeah. Well, also yes. But she is the teacher and authority figure who is also the abuser, who is terrible and who dies, and it is a redemptive death. But she also, like, she doesn't seem to grapple that much with the morality of, like, is the Horde good? Is it bad? Whatever. She just wants power, and she's pretty clear on that. But she does come to some kind of realization that despite her own craving for power, which is the main thing that has driven her, she actually does want to have the world be saved, and specifically to have Adora and Catra be able to do it. And she does sacrifice herself for both of them, which it just strikes me as there's enough similarity there of, like, this is the bad to morally questionable character, but it worked a lot better for me than the Snape stuff did.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't get to the epilogue where we find out that Adora and Catra named their child Shadow Weaver Hordak, so... One thing that I thought was really interesting that really came out in the last season is the way that Shadow Weaver interacts with Castaspella, the greatest name in the show. I love that they didn't change any of the names. They were like, these are the characters' names. We're going to take it completely seriously. Like, love it. But it's really clear that she had a very similar dynamic with Micah and Castaspella that she does with Adora and Catra, where she's like, this is my favorite student who is good and clever and who I love and will talk about how great they are all the time. And then there's the garbage one.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, it's not just these two kids. This is who she is as a person. This is how she divides and conquers. And that this is, like, abuse is a pattern. And I appreciate is a weird word to use. Like, I'm so glad she abused 4 people instead of 2, but, like, I appreciated that was sort of illuminated for us as viewers. And yeah, like, I joked about the epilogue, but she gets her moment. It is deeply moving and probably fairly traumatic for Adora and Catra to witness it. Like, they're both sobbing because this is their mother, basically. Yeah. But there's not a moment where everybody's like, let's all remember how Shadow Weaver sacrificed everything to save. Like, that's what she gets. And that is what she has earned. She has not earned anything more. Please let there be a therapist somewhere on this planet, because Adora and Catra really need one.
Yeah, I think, and for me, there's 2 things there. One is, you know, we get her origin story as how she becomes from light spinner to Shadow Weaver, and, you know, it's not really played out much, but I remember feeling like some sympathy for her and feeling like that maybe, you know, the idea that, like, the Princess Council at that point isn't taking the threat seriously enough, and so you understand where she makes her sort of heel turn. But getting to what you were saying about that idea of redemption comes from healing, you know, doing good. And as I always understood it, at least, it's not even just that it's about, like, do good things to make up for the bad. It's, can you heal the actual brokenness that you caused? And for me, the fact that she doesn't say a word to Adora at the very end, she speaks directly to Catra and says, Catra, I am so very proud of you. It felt like to me that's some degree of her recognizing the damage that she did to Catra throughout the lives of those two. The one thing there's so much that this show gave us in terms of like wrapping up every storyline. I wish we had more of a confrontation or some kind of acknowledgement of the past when Micah and Shadow Weaver reconnect. That was the one sort of thing that I wished we'd gotten more of. And it may have been because they weren't ready to take Shadow Weaver's story there yet, and they wanted to have it more with Catra, but I would have liked that story to get wrapped up a little more.
Yeah, I feel like there were a few little plot lines involving Shadow Weaver that didn't really resolve, like the idea that she might be teaching Glimmer to use dark magic. Oh, I guess she wasn't, and it's fine? Okay. Like that didn't really get wrapped up. And like the show does not have a long runtime. Like they're short episodes, 13 episodes a season. I think they had to choose where they were going to put their attention, and I think they put it in the right places, but I do still have some things where I'm like, I wish that had been tied up a little bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also, So something that I think is really interesting about Shadow Weaver. So there's a moment when she and Casta are like figuring out that they have to go free the Heart of Etheria and all the magic, and it acknowledges that she has basically everything she's done in the show has been in pursuit of power, because she's like, we can do this, and then you have to be there to stop me if I try and take the power, which I thought was really interesting. One thing the show doesn't entirely address, but that I think is fascinating, is that Shadow Weaver is right about magic.
Yes.
Because they do touch, like, she does say, like, that what the council taught us was wrong, and through the whole thing you find out, like, Etheria is this magical planet, but that the first ones had been, like, harnessing it and changing it, and all of the magic that they're using now is really based much more on what the first ones did. And she is the one who says, there is other magic here, there is more we can do, we don't need to be bound by this, and it turns out that the first one's magic, or the first one's messing around, had really hurt the magic, and they have to free it, which is what saves the day. I mean, and that and Shira and love, but,
right.
Like, that's the tool that is used for saving the day, and that Shadow Weaver was right. Yeah. Shadow Weaver, who is not a good person, but a very interesting character, in her pursuit of power, came to some very correct conclusions about what was going on. And I don't quite know what to do with that, but I do think it's really interesting.
Well, I think
Go ahead.
If you want to say that the theme of season 5 and of the show overall is that you do not have to sacrifice yourself to be happy, and that you deserve happiness, then I think you can argue that the theme of season 4 is that the ends do not justify the means. Mm-hmm. And Shadow Weaver is a great example of that. Like, she's right, but everything she does in pursuit of that is wrong. And Glimmer is not wrong, but her actions are very wrong.
Yeah.
And over again, and this is extremely common for media in general, especially for children's shows, we see characters taking shortcuts or trying to do something for a good outcome, but doing it in a way that is harmful. And the show is very clear that no, you can't do that. Like, there are no shortcuts here.
And to me, it's interesting because I think especially with both Glimmer and Shadow Weaver, it's not even just that they want to do the good thing and take a shortcut. Becky, we're going to get kind of Star Wars here. It's that I think in both cases, what they're motivated more than anything else is by fear. Glimmer especially is so afraid of the coming, the possible complete annihilation of everything, and that it's going to be her fault to some extent. That's part of what drives her to say, like, therefore we should use the weapon. We should use the thing. And Shadow Weaver is kind of the same way. And I think it's such an interesting, because again, like, Glimmer never has anything but the purest of intentions. Maybe we can start talking about her now. She never wants. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that Shadow Weaver is not as driven by fear as you do. I think she is motivated by wanting that power and sees Glimmer to some extent as a tool to get it. And there may also be some fear in there and some genuine, like, I want to help. But I see her as a character who is much more motivated by pursuit of power than by fear.
That's fair. I think it's a Palpatine Anakin thing.
Mm-hmm. That can make sense. I think by the last season, she's more motivated, not even by fear, but isn't like, this is what we have to do to win. But you're right, also the power there, for sure.
Well, and that's why that moment with Casta, where she acknowledges that she wants this kind of power, but that this is not the time. I think that's why that's such an interesting and good moment.
One other thing I just want to say about Shadow Weaver that I always really appreciated, the actress who voices her, Lorraine Toussaint, a fantastic actress. She's been in a number of things. She herself is a woman of color. She's black. And I loved that because the race of the character is not at all, I mean, I think she's supposed to be from some alien race. I have no idea what her actual race is. And it just, I think, again, there's often the default of like, okay, well, if we don't know the race of a character, we'll have it done by a white actor. And so I just loved that Lorraine Toussaint, who I thought was perfect for that role, got that voice.
Yeah, you can tell that like there is thought put into not just diversity of what we can see in the drawings of the characters, but the actual cast.
Yeah. It was not surprising to me, but I thought it was a powerful again symbol when the character of Double Trouble, who another one of my absolute favorites, and that character who is non-binary is voiced by an actor who is non-binary.
Yeah. My understanding is that was very important to them, and I also love Double Trouble so much.
Well, it makes so much sense. Like once you encounter a character who's literally a shapeshifter and can bounce back and forth like that, like not that you have to be non-binary, but it sort of seems like, you know, the idea that every other shapeshifter hasn't been exploring this already it just felt there were so many things I loved about that character, but that part especially.
Yeah, I also really appreciated that right from the get-go, like everybody was using they them pronouns for Double Trouble, and like there was like it was just instant. Nobody was ever confused about it. I mean, this is not the kind of show where that would happen, but the good guys never misgendered them. Yep. Even though they were on the other side, they were all just like, no, it's Double Trouble. They use they them pronouns.
Yeah,
and they're
completely taken for it wasn't a big deal that had to be commented on in any way.
No.
So let's start to get into Glimmer, because that was one we started to talk about. And she is also, I think, a very interesting character, because in some ways she becomes the Catra. I think Becky, you made that point that she becomes the new best friend and has some of the same struggles of being in her shadow and then also kind of coming into herself when she becomes the queen. What's your kind of take on her journey and her role in the show?
Oh, I think it was Jess who had said that.
Oh, my apologies.
But was correct.
We're kind of the same person, so it's fine.
yeah, no, we're very similar. I love Glimmer, and I also think she is a really interesting and complicated character. I will say just up front, I had a really hard time with season 4. I thought it was well done, but her motivation and her fear and her anger come so much from grief and her mother's death, which is something that I am super sensitive to in media, since my mother died some years ago. So I actually had a really hard time watching season 4 and spent a lot of it like unhappy and upset with Glimmer in ways that I don't think were fair to her character. But I did think that letting a good guy, like a hero character who has never been anything but a heroic character, do something that we all knew watching was going to be as wrong and as bad an idea as let's turn on the super weapon even though we know it's not gonna work, and then letting all of season 5 be the consequences of that, I thought was really interesting, and I was really glad that there was sort of a mini arc of Beau, who has been the most loyal and kindest and friendship-focused character on this show that is entirely about friendship, letting him actually be angry and have to work through those feelings because she didn't listen to Adora, she didn't listen to Beau, she made the wrong choice, she cost everybody a lot, and he gets to be mad about that. And so I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I found parts of the season very frustrating, and I found myself getting extremely frustrated with Glimmer, not for the same personal reasons, but I also, honestly, I thought that the writing was a little weak there.
It felt a little more contrived, the way
well,
that the friends fought. To me,
for me, I think it was not I think the problem for me was that they had the same fight 4 episodes in a row and they resolved it each time. And I think that's what made it feel contrived. It wasn't necessarily the choices that they made, but that it was like, no, but we already talked about this and we chilled out about it. Oh, we're doing it again. Okay. Because they still needed to get Glimmer to that point, but they couldn't bear to have her on the outs with Adora and Bo for quite that long. So they kept making up, and then she went right back to where she, like, that was what was the problem for me, that it was very repetitive.
That makes a ton of sense. I think that's a really good framing of it, because I hadn't quite picked up on it, but that makes that's what happened.
Yeah, and that does make it feel contrived, because in real life, people do have arguments over and over again, but in fiction, you generally, especially, like, these characters are so good at growing and learning. Like, grow and learn, Glimmer.
And it's funny because I actually had the same frustration with a lot of that part of the show because of Catra. Because it felt to me like Catra was starting to get so close to rock bottom, but they kept dragging it out. And to the point, and there's that devastating scene where Double Trouble just kind of lays out for Catra, like all the ways in which, everything is falling apart for Catra. And I was like, okay, that's going to be the moment. That's going to be, Catra's turn. And when season 5 started with Catra still at that same place, I was a little frustrated. And then when like 2 episodes in, she makes her turn, I was like, okay, thank God. Like we're not going to keep doing that. But and I think you're right. I think in some ways, a lot of season 4 felt a little bit like they were one step away from where they wanted to go, and now they just had to kind of drag out the story a little more.
Yeah. And speaking of which, real quick, but speaking of things that didn't really get resolved, I wanted to know more about Double Trouble working for Glimmer for a hot minute, because that was like literally a blink and you missed it thing where once he has gone back to the Fright Zone and done what he needs, they have gone back to the Fright Zone and done what they need to do. They signal Glimmer, and Glimmer's like, cool. And then that's never ever addressed again. And Double Trouble is only in like the nightclub episode and a cameo shot in the finale after that.
Right.
Which is another example of like things that Glimmer is doing that nobody in her life would approve of, but we don't get to see that part explored as much. And I mean, quite frankly, I just would have loved a scene between Glimmer and Double Trouble where that's discussed, because it would have been wildly entertaining.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, again, like, these characters read as very young to me, and I think it's really interesting to see Glimmer, who has always been this very impulsive character who is not good at listening to other people, suddenly have to deal with having the weight of ruling on her shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
And she kind of cracks a little under that. I can forgive her for that choice, but I just think it's really interesting that they took this character who is literally a sparkly magical princess who's all like lavender and pink, and they're like, yeah, she turned on a super weapon that could wipe out a galaxy. It's fine.
Yeah, it's kind of great. Yeah, Glimmer, and we talked at one point about the age of the characters not really being clear. Glimmer especially was the one who always to me felt like not even like she's kind of just right on that edge of puberty when the show was getting started, and especially like, and then the dynamic with Bo and her is never complete. They don't have a kiss, but I certainly should have walked away feeling like we're supposed to think that they were romantically connecting by the end of the show.
Which was weird to me, but yeah. I mean, Mazel Tov, I guess.
Yeah,
well, yeah, it's one of those things where I was like, well, that's fine. Like, I have no feelings about that.
To me, the only reason why I brought it up is because I felt one of the most interesting moments of Glimmer, of seeing like just how she's kind of like the youngest of the group, is the Princess Prom episode, where I forget the details, but like Beau winds up going with or dancing with some other princess, and
his Perfuma's date.
Right. And Glimmer is very jealous, but in a way that, like, I feel like even she says, like, it's not clear, like, is this a romantic jealousy? Is this a friend jealousy? Like, what's going on there? That read to me very much as, like, I'm having all these feelings and I don't understand what they are yet because I'm just starting to have them. Just in terms of, like, where she is age-wise with all the others.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of age, I remember when season 1 came out, people were asking Noelle Stevenson, who's the creator of the show, and it was, as I recall, her answer was like, I know why you're asking, because there was an undercurrent of people wanting to prove that Scorpia was too old for Catra so that they could vilify her and remain true to Catradora as a ship, which,
it's horrifying.
Like, Scorpia is a cinnamon roll. But as I recall, Noelle's answer was somewhere along the lines of, they are all about the same age and it's old enough. Like, whatever age you feel like they are, that's the age they are. Nobody's a creep.
Well, and one thing I love so much about the show in general, actually, is that, and I'm almost certain this was entirely intentional, a lot of times these kind of shows, especially like with princess characters, the romantic relationship is privileged so much above every other. And I really appreciate that while there is obviously romance in the show, and especially between two of our main characters, that the friendship bonds are also very important. And I will go to my grave thinking that Scorpia doesn't have any romantic feelings towards Catra. That is very much a friendship feeling. But that the, like, I sort of get annoyed at the idea that, like, for it to be as important as it was to Scorpia, it has to be romantic. Like, to me, I really like that as a kind of a, like, no, this is a very deep friendship, affection and love. It doesn't have to be romance for it to be that important.
Yeah, I mean, I think she was into Catra, but
that's fine too.
I think the show, it doesn't really set a clear boundary between those things because, like you said, there's no hierarchy. Perfuma talks a lot about her power of friendship towards the end of the show, and what a good friend Scorpia is. They're girlfriends. Like, again, Noelle Stevenson is like, they are girlfriends now. They are together. They are an item. And what exactly the dynamic is by the end of the show between Glimmer and Beau is not totally clear. What exactly the dynamic is between Mermista and Seahawk is not totally clear until the end of the show. Like, I think Adora and Catra is pretty obvious from the get-go, but the only one that they really, like, put a label on is Natasha and Spinnerella. But I think it's part and parcel of the show's, like, we don't need to label this character's gender or sexuality or anything about their presentation. What's important is who they are and how they feel.
Yeah.
And it to me, the nebulous nature of those relationships is partially because the show has a very young target audience, and partially, I'm sure, because there is, network pushback or whatever you call it when it's, Netflix and not broadcast TV. But also partially to allow for everybody to see what they need to see in it.
Yeah. And this is super obvious, but I do think, like, it is amazing and important that they did that, and also amazing and important that they did just let Catra and Adora be gay.
Yes.
Like,
very much
they
so.
kissed. Which honestly did surprise me. I had expected, because there was so little defining of relationships, and because it is a show that is marketed to children, and having same-sex relationships in children's media is still a whole thing, although not as difficult as it used to be, clearly. I had expected it to be, I love you, like, we save each other, we end up, we hug, and I had expected it to be left ambiguous, and the fact that it wasn't, and that they kissed, like, I screamed, and then I had to pause the show and take a minute, and then I had to go, like, explode at my sister about how overwhelmed I was. So I think that they do a lot right with the relationships. We were led into this by talking about Glimmer, and this was not at all related to her, but we hadn't talked about that much. I don't think it needs to be talked about that much because it's kind of the big thing that everyone knows is a big thing, but it's such a big thing.
It really is, and I will not to say a little bit more about it. I feel like there's definitely a romantic implication among a number of the other pairings, but to me, I feel like if we'd had, Scorpia and Perfuma had kissed, and Mermista and Seahawk had kissed, and Bo and Glimmer, like, if we'd seen all that, I felt like it almost would have cheapened Adora and Catra a little bit. The fact that they're the only ones who explicitly crossed that line, other than the couple we've already established, to me, it made that much more powerful.
Yeah, I think, like, you have to maintain that centrality. Although we were talking about how the opening credits change almost every episode in season 5 to reflect, like, who is and is not a good guy, or, chipped or not chipped. By the end, Natasha and Spinnerella are just making out in the end credits. Like, it's just fantastic. But so I just looked it up. Legend of Korra, the final episode, aired in December of 2014. So that's 5.5 years ago, which is not a very long time. And I remember when that episode
people were
ended.
shocked.
Spoilers! I haven't finished that show yet.
Are you kidding? Because
it's okay.
You know how it ends, though, right?
I have literally no idea, but it's fine. Go ahead and tell me.
It ends with the show begins with Korra at the heart of a love triangle between two brothers. Right. And it ends with her holding hands with one of the brothers' ex-girlfriend. Okay, that's fantastic. And I like that a lot. It's fabulous. It's made very, very clear in, like, the ongoing comics and stuff, because, there's other media that ties into it, that they are absolutely a couple. No question. 100%. Yeah.
But they couldn't kiss.
They couldn't kiss.
They weren't allowed.
Ugh.
It was shocking. That ending was shocking. Like, people, like, there are video compilations. You can go on YouTube and you can see compilations of people weeping as they respond, like, just watching that last episode, and the shock and the joy on their faces. And we are not that far off, and this show had 10,000 lesbians in it. Like,
it really.
I mean, again, not to put labels on anybody, but it did.
Oh,
honestly, on my Tumblr, I had literally posted, wow, so Korasami walked so that Catradora could run, because, like...
Exactly!
So good.
It felt like it was something that had been built to by media for a while, but the fact that they could now just literally have the two girls kiss, like, oh... Yeah. I'm so happy.
The two girls kiss the other couple who, they are married, and they kiss in the credits, and all these other couples and all these other very obviously queer characters, like what was that one cartoon a few years ago, maybe around the same time as Korra, where, like, it was like the Loud family or something, where, like, one of the kids in the main family had a friend who had two dads, and it was, like, hugely scandalous. And wasn't there a Disney Channel show that, like, got canceled because somebody had two moms?
Good Luck Charlie on the Disney Channel, I believe, got canceled after airing an episode where the kindergartner had a classmate who had two moms. And that would have been around 2011, maybe? That is a guess, but sometime of that era. So, like... this is a quick evolution, but it's amazing.
And I will say, I am someone who, because of my connections to the religious world, I see a lot of what goes out from the religious right kind of things, because I like to know, like, what they're talking about. And, maybe it's just because they're so worried about how masks are the work of the devil, but there's not been a peep about this show and about this kiss, which I think is a really, I'm hoping that's a sign of a little bit more progress. I have no idea, but one other thing I'll say about that also, and I say this as someone who I have been in and out of queer communities myself, and my own identity there has been kind of very amorphous and shifting, and so I'm not trying to claim my own role in a community, but something I've seen both from my own participation, but also just from a lot of my study, this gets talked about a lot, is the idea that one of often the things that happens in queer communities is that the line of friendship and relationship becomes a lot more blurred, and that there often is, like, when you see things about, like, queer values that the straight world should adopt, one I often see is, like, love your friends and, like, tell your friends they love and honor friendship as well as romantic relationships. And given how much the Noelle Stevenson has really said that the queer flavor of this show was very intentional, just kind of going back to the conversation we're having about the line of friendship and relationship, it's occurring to me now that that's probably also something that she was very intentional about wanting that to be a very blurred line.
Yeah, I'm straight. I don't want to say this from a perspective. I don't want to be speaking outside of my lane here, but to me, watching the show, this is not just a show that has a central romantic relationship between two female characters. This is a queer show absolutely in every single aspect of it, top to bottom, inside and out. Like, everything about it is joyously queer. Mm-hmm. And it's so beautiful to see that.
Yep.
They save the world with rainbows bursting ever. Like, literally, She-Ra kisses her girlfriend and then waves her sword at everything and hits it with rainbows.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, it definitely felt that way to me. Kind of transitioning to a couple other characters, and this is kind of a redemption thing, but to me it flows out of the power of friendship. It turns out not to be the world-saving moment that at first I thought it was, but I had a beautiful moment where it seemed like the thing that was going to stop the evil plan was Entrapta's friendship with Hordak. And that just so blew me away as, like, at first we see Entrapta as just kind of quirky and ridiculous, but the more that character grows and goes on, and you start to see her just, like, because she seems it's so weird that she's willing to be a supporter of so much terribleness, but she's so happy and joyous. She just, like, she builds these friendships with these murder robots and with Scorpia and with Hordak even, and I don't think we get a real like redemption arc to Hordak, but he gets that one moment, which I mentioned I was going to bring up Star Wars, him basically turning on the other Hordak and dropping him down this, like, bottomless pit in a space.
Oh, incredibly Star Wars.
It was, yeah. No, that was.
But I don't think you can watch that and not be like, bye, Palpatine.
Okay, I'm glad I was not the only one.
No, but not the only one. Oh my gosh.
But it just. And again, we didn't wind up saving everything, but it made a difference. For me, the idea that friendship was the thing that had so much power, it was like, okay, I get it. Friendship matters. I love this so much.
Well, there's sort of an idea in the show, and it's one that I really love when I see in media, which is that all anybody needs is a chance.
Yeah.
Like, all you need to do is show somebody that there's another way, that there's a better way, that they can be valued, and that there is good, and that there is friendship. Like, a lot of these characters, I mean, some characters really struggle to get over there, Catra obviously being the major one, but a lot of these characters, it's a very, like, they just, like, take wrong Hordak out of the thing a little bit early by accident, and they're like, oh, here's how you wink, and he's like, I'm a good guy now. Like, he's literally been grown in a vat to be evil, but the second he's shown another way to be, like, the characters all still have agency, and characters like Catra and regular Hordak still have to decide that is what they are going to do.
Right.
But it's the smallest seed is necessary sometimes to allow that to flower, as Perfuma would probably say.
Well, and speaking of Perfuma, there's a whole thing where it seems like they're setting up for what's a pretty typical, like, level up and badass whatever, where they tell her, like, you have to stop being afraid of hurting your friends so that you can be more powerful. And she out of hand and correctly rejects that as like, but my friendship and how much I care about my friends is my power.
Yeah.
That's what makes me a powerful person. That's what makes me a good person. That's why I do the things I do. And she never has to let go of that and prioritize something above friendship. And her faith in friendship and her belief that people who are friends matter and that that relationship is so important is part of when Scorpia has been chipped and she has that moment where she doesn't kill them. It's very explicit that that's why, and it's because of the strength of that friendship and how Perfuma's belief that friendship is the most important thing is correct.
Yeah. I think that's really true. And I love the fact that all these characters get redemption arcs, especially because, Jess, when you were on talking about the Punisher, one thing we talked about, especially in the last season, as being kind of frustrated with, is the idea of showing trauma in a villain's past to explain their villainy, but in a way that kind of feels like, if you have trauma, you're going to become evil, And what I kind of love is that here, every character who has become a villain because of trauma in their past also gets to have a redemption. And not that I feel like Hordak's is deserved, but like even Hordak, we learn like had this really awful relationship with Big Brother, whatever. And in each case, it felt like the fact that like, and the only person who we never know his trauma, we never know why he became a villain, is also the one who doesn't ever get a redemption. It's Hordak Prime. And that, to me, it was one more thing that felt, I think, was intentional and felt so striking, of breaking away from the idea of you've had this trauma and that explains it, but it's still okay for us all to hate you because you're an evil villain.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of, like, villains, first of all, can I just say that I love that you drew an analogy between She-Ra and the Punisher. Specifically, we were talking about Perfuma, and you were like, this reminds me of the Punisher, and that's why this is an excellent podcast.
Thank you very much.
But, I mean, when you think of, like the villains are called the Horde, and I know the full name is the Evil Horde, and I do still love that bit in, like, the first or second episode.
Who calls
where
us
both
that?
like, Everyone!
Yeah. You're from the fright zone.
But, like, the other word that I think of with Horde is faceless. Like, there's this idea that it's just like this undifferentiated evil mass. And as soon as anybody gets individuality, the show no longer presents them as somebody to be hated. Like, once somebody is a person, then they get to be treated like a person.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say that a huge part of Horde Prime's villainy is his lack of respect for individuality. Obviously, like, he wants to have a hive mind. He has cloned himself innumerable times. He wants to remake the universe in his image, and when a body is no longer useful to him, he'll just move into the next one.
Right.
And I think that's a big part of why he cannot be redeemed, because he is, I mean, yeah, like, obviously he's one character, but, like, he's trying really hard not to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely got both Borg and Ultron feelings from him.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I like that point you made, because kind of I was the segue was intended to be a little bit to talk about Hordak and Entrapta specifically, because part of what the connection I just made is what you're saying about how we get to see that, each of these people gets to be an individual. It seems like Entrapta's superpower is that she can see that in the people no one else can. She can even see that in Hordak. She can see it in the bot that becomes Emily, which the scene of, like, them reuniting and hugging, like, I've never had a box on wheels that make me tear up like that, but it was so good.
And when wrong Hordak is afraid to pet Emily and then does.
It was so good.
Well, and the thing that Entrapta says to Hordak that is so meaningful to him and that she brings back, and which, like, made me tear up when she said it the second time, is, your imperfections make you beautiful.
Yeah.
Like, that's such a beautiful idea, and it's so much part and parcel of the show's ethos in general, and it's so much a part of who Entrapta is as a person. and would be such a revolutionary concept to somebody like Hordak, who is literally a clone.
Right. And who's thrown out because he is an imperfect clone.
Yeah.
The line about your imperfections make me beautiful, your imperfections make me beautiful. There are so many lines in the show, especially in like the last 4 episodes, that sort of felt like that line sounds like something that like a child's therapist would have like framed in their office. And yet none of them feel like, slogans. They all feel very real and earned, even if they're like, this could be, like I said, just in like a self-help book so easily. What is kind of your feeling? Like Entrapta to me is one of the most interesting because I feel like she really is the most balanced between her time as like a hero or a villain. And to some extent, I feel like she, in part because she never cares about the morality of either one. It's just about who are my friends and who's going to let me play with the toys. Where do you kind of see her character?
I see her as somebody who grows who grows in her morality. Because she really, in the first couple of seasons, doesn't worry about morality, like, at all. She is interested in tech, and that's pretty much all she's interested in, and she likes her friendships. I mean, it's not as if they are, things she is completely divorced from or ignoring, but she is driven mostly by her desire to learn more about technology. And through working with Hordak and seeing him as a partner, and then coming back to the other princesses and realizing like that they care about her and that she is now taking the tech that is the thing she has always cared about the most and trying to use that as a way to help them and bond with them and thus save the day. I think shows growth in her understanding of what's important and her own moral decisions, which I think is, again, a really good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that Entrapta in season 1 or 2 would have tried to stop Catra from opening the portal. I think she would have been curious and would have been like, oh, let's find out what happens, because she is very reckless with her experimentation when we first meet her. And
she is the one who wants to hack the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she sort of learns about consequences she learns about consequences, but not in a way that fundamentally changes who she is, because I would be very uncomfortable with the show ever suggesting that she is wrong the way she is, and they don't.
Right.
Like, I mean, and she's impossible to be mad at. Like, you can be mad at Glimmer, you can be mad at Catra, but with Entrapta, you're like, yeah. Like, nothing that she does is ever motivated by, she makes the wrong choices sometimes, but it's never out of spite or pettiness or some of the more negative emotions that can sometimes compel the other characters.
There was a panel at WisCon a couple of years ago. I don't remember if either of you were in it with me. And a person I've been frantically Googling, trying to remember the name of this person and find it, and I can't find it. But if I do, I'll definitely put it in the show notes. But
was this the She-Ra panel?
Yeah.
I was on it.
Oh, okay. Well, then you may remember who said this, because there was one person who said that they really related to Entrapta in part, and this was the first person who had heard talk about Entrapta as someone who's autistic can possibly relate to. And the person was very clear of saying, like, it's not that like Entrapta speaks for all people with autism, but that they, as an autistic person, could see a lot of themselves in Entrapta. And one of the things that they said was that they often feel like they have to remind themselves to think about right and wrong, because it just, the way their brain chemistry works, like that's just often not a part of their thinking. And that they really identified with Entrapta because that's what they saw Entrapta doing. It's not that Entrapta's making moral choices. It's just that they kind of forget that that's a thing you're supposed to care about.
I think it was Alexandra Aaron who was saying that.
That is correct. Thank you very much. And I just thought that blew me away. And it was something, and I got Alexandra's contact information, have meant to get them on the podcast to talk about that. Have never had a chance. Hopefully we'll still, and thank you for reminding me again of their name. But yeah, I think that what you were saying reminded me of that idea of like, you know, just not thinking about morality in that way.
Yeah. I mean, this is like, it's a silly joke, but when Natasha is talking about everybody's weaknesses, which is such a Batman thing, I was like, I can't believe Natasha went full Batman.
I loved that, though. Oh my god.
It was so good. When she just takes out the scissors and cuts Bo's bowstring.
Yes, it was so good.
But she just like throws a random piece of tech across the room, and Entrapta goes running off, and she's like, tech.
Yeah.
Mermista, fire. Frosta, also fire. Perfuma, your inability to hurt your friends, and fire.
Yeah.
But I also think that's why it's powerful in the episode where they're trying to get closer to the signal, and everybody gets really mad at Entrapta, and she finally, like she says explicitly, and I'm glad she did, she's like, I'm bad at friends, I'm bad at people, but I'm good at tech, and so I thought I could use tech as a way to help my friends.
Yeah.
And I thought that it was really nice that they had brought her from being somebody who had not been thinking about friendships in that way, when they try to go save her from the fright zone, and she's like, actually, there's tech here, and I think I'm gonna stay, and she clearly bears them no ill will, but does not think about the ramifications of what she's doing on her friends, and having that evolve into somebody who is still not great at that kind of friendship, but who now understands or recognizes this is what I care about, and so I'm going to use my skill to help, instead of I only care about this skill that I have.
Yeah, and
I just thought it was a nice evolution.
And I really liked it because it's, in some ways, in that regard, she makes a similar choice to Catra, but from such a different place. Catra is coming from anger and malice and spite and really deep hurt. And as you said, because Catra feels like, you know, Adora chose someone else. Entrapta also feels like her friends abandoned her, but she's not mad at all about it. And she's sort of just like, well, I'm not good at friends, but now Hordak and Emily and Scorpia are my friends, so that's who I want to stay with. And in some ways, it felt like it's the same decision, but from such a different place than Catra comes from. And it just really was, it was touching to me, especially because it made them all kind of wonder, like, how were we treating Entrapta, and did we leave her behind, or that kind of thing.
Yeah. I also really love, sort of related to that, how Scorpia is only able to see that Catra does not treat her well when she sees what Catra has done to Entrapta, which I think is, you know, very much a relatable thing. Like, we let people do things to us that we would never let them do to our friends.
Yeah.
And I like that Catra and Scorpia ended up in a good place. Like, obviously we all love Catra. Like, I'm not like, throw in the garbage, she was mean to Scorpia, but like, I am glad that Scorpia was able to see that she did not deserve to be treated like that, and that she, you know, was able to have this relationship by the end of the show with someone who is just like inexhaustibly positive. Like, it just makes me so happy.
Yeah.
Perfume is going to be so nice to her.
And it also just reminds me of, I don't know if we're going to go deep dive on this character as well, though we really could. The fact that Scorpia is one of the, like, you know, quote unquote bad guys, and is just such this incredible ball of sunshine and happiness and just wanting to be everyone's friend.
She is an absolute angel, and she is drawn to look like a scary monster. Like, she is enormous, and she has pincers, and she is the sweetest little cupcake. Like, I just love her to pieces.
Yeah.
She's wonderful. And it's friendship that gets her the redemption as well, because she is an antagonist for the first 3.5 seasons. And she helps the Horde, and she wants to defeat the princesses. But when she realizes that Catra is a bad friend, that's her moment, is she says to Catra, "You're a bad friend."
Yeah,
so good.
Yeah. But she realizes Catra is a bad friend, but Entrapta was a good friend and someone she cares about, and so she goes to the princesses and says, "This is my friend, she's also your friend, help me save her." And because the princesses are willing to help her and embrace her for who she is and treat her with respect and as a friend, she is then redeemed and is just a good guy from then on.
Yeah.
She's still, you know, she cares about Catra, but she's not going to help the Horde anymore.
I'm also...
Go ahead.
Scorpia's so good, I love her.
I'm really fascinated by the history of her family as collaborators, and they don't do much with that, but it's so interesting.
Yeah. I've joked, I think we talked about it on a podcast, and I'm the person who wants to like read the full print, I want to read the full Sokovia Accords. And I want to like know, on a podcast about the Clone Wars, like I want to read the Constitution of the Republic and the Jedi and all that. And in the same way, like I'm so curious about the power structure of this world where like these princesses not only have these superpowers, but also are like this ruling body and what in the world's going on. You could, if you told me you were doing a spin-off show about like, that first generation of like, Scorpia's parents and Micah and all that, like I'd be so in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the show has a really rich lore behind it. I mean, there's just like the idea that there's like elemental princesses and they're just like degular princesses. Like Natas is a princess, but she has magic powers, but she doesn't have a rune stone and she doesn't need to be connected to the heart of Etheria for it to work. I was actually like a little confused as to why Entrapta wasn't required for that, because she was the princess of Trill, but she doesn't have a rune stone, and like it's kind of convoluted.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I know Becky wanted to talk about the first ones, and
yes.
I think that we sort of led into that.
I think they are the source of some of that.
Yes.
So one thing I wasn't clear on, but I think, is that there were people, there was intelligent life, human-ish, on Etheria before the first ones. And then the first ones colonized Etheria. I think that's what happened, but they aren't super clear, so it may have just been that the first ones discovered Etheria, which had, native flora and fauna, but no intelligent human-esque life. But I think there was...
Because all the first ones, well, the only human first one that we see is Mara, and all of the AIs are presumably modeled after what the first ones looked like. So I wonder if like all of the basically anthropomorphic animal characters might have been the first Etherians, but I don't know.
Yeah, I was wondering, well, also because, I mean, Adora is a first one who was brought to Etheria, and what I got from that was the implication that the people who are now on Etheria are not first ones. So it's very unclear, but the way I read it again,
they're the descendants of the first ones, and they still, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, well, that's what I thought, but I felt like there was some, I don't remember when it was, but that they had said explicitly that Adora had to be brought in because she was a first one, and the implication I got from that was that meant that the people still on Etheria weren't. But again, unclear, so I could have completely misunderstood or misread that. But
I guess it could go either way, because like could Bo wield the sword? Well, he's not a first one, but is that because he's too many generations removed from the first ones, or is it because he is fundamentally a different species?
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so there was Etheria, which was this planet which had magic and I think human-esque life, and they were colonized by the first ones. And the first ones messed with the planet and tried to turn it into a weapon, and they also took what was its inherent power and harnessed it and changed it. And so, like, what I thought was really interesting is that they have, like, at some point, Adora learns that She-Ra existed before the first ones came to Etheria. She-Ra was Etherian, and then the first ones created the sword, and that took control of She-Ra, and it made She-Ra into part of their weapon.
Right.
And all of this, it turns out, was like the first ones were at war with Horde Prime and were defeated. And Mara pulled them into the Despondos, and they're in this other dimension until they end up getting shoved back. But the characters on the show don't really look at First Ones as colonizers. They look at them more as ancestors, and they don't know how their own culture was changed radically. They don't know that, the planet was turned into a machine and a weapon. And they eventually, the weapon, it turns out, is bad pretty much no matter what. And they have to not just defeat Horde Prime, they also have to free Etheria of this First One's influence in order to save Etheria. Which I thought was really interesting, but I also, I assume that some of the princesses are important and some are not, or are elemental and some are not, because the first one said, oh, these are the ones we care about, and that's how we're going to do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just think it's a really interesting thing in the background of the show that it is kind of anti-colonial, which is good, but it also doesn't ever really get into that very much.
I really like that point, especially and Becky, you're saying, and just the one thing you said about sort of the non-human characters. I was when my partner Abby joined me for at least part of my 3-season binge over the last 36 hours. And one of the things that she asked at one point, or she was pointing out, was that all of the anthropomorphic animal characters, both Catra and Scorpia, but then also like Rogelio and the goat person and so many people we meet in the Crimson Wastes, there are no anthropomorphic people, like anthropomorphic humanoid animals among the princesses or among the good guys. They're all either the kind of like nefarious types in the Crimson Wastes, or they're straight up villains, part of the Horde. And so now I am wondering if like, that part of what the first ones did, or part that's at some point in the past, there was some like the humans taking power over the anthropomorphized and animal types. I have no idea. This is all headcanon, but it that distinction is so firm that it feels like it must be intentional. And I wonder how it ties into the history with the first ones or any of that.
Well, there are definitely good guys, or at least neutral guys, who are anthropomorphic animals, because a lot of the villagers are either they're animal people, and then there's the village that's like all mushroom people in the last season, and I loved the mushroom people so much. There's like that little guy with the mustache. I love him. It's my favorite character in the show.
Yeah. Yeah, at first I couldn't tell if it was hats, and I was like, nope, that's just, they have a mushroom for a head.
Nope, okay. They're just mushrooms. I love them. I love them so much.
And you're right, they're neutral, but I think nowhere in the power structure, none of the princesses, nowhere in the princesses' families at all.
They're not in the ruling class. The other thing that's, I think, noteworthy is Glimmer's mother, Queen Angela. She's not human, and Glimmer says specifically, she's describing her parentage, and she says, I'm the daughter of a sorcerer, and she says something like an ethereal being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something with the word angel in it.
Yeah, she's not human, and we don't see anybody else like Queen Angela, so like we don't know what she is either. So yeah, I also would be very interested to know which populations are and are not indigenous to Etheria, and how they have changed because of the first ones or other whatever else may have changed them. Because there's also the question of like, they're on a planet with magic, so who knows what effect that has on evolution.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point too.
Because, I mean, Swiftwind used to just be a horse.
And I loved that Swiftwind, when he turns into Swiftwind, is immediately like, okay, now it's time to go free all the horses.
Also, side note, I love that Swiftwind, like, Adora, because she is She-Ra, and like it's because this was the case in the original show, but also because this is the kind of show that this is, she has to have a beautiful flying unicorn with rainbow wings as her noble steed, but he is useless. He like occasionally shows up and is annoying, and then he leaves, and he does like maybe 2 things that are helpful ever.
And he's so sassy and campy in such a hilarious but like not fitting the mold way.
And like he's so excited for his boys' night out with Seahawk and Bo.
Such a good night.
Yeah, Swift wins.
So we've gone for quite a while. There's a number of other characters we could talk about. I'm happy to talk about this all night, but I'm sure that you have other, things you need to be doing with your lives. Are there other things that we want to touch on before we start to wrap up?
I love Mermista so much. Like, I don't have anything deep to say about her. I just love her every time. I do. It's not deep, but the Mer Mysteries episode is the best
so
episode,
good.
And it's incredible, and I loved every second of it.
Well,
I also love Mermista. I love that she gets to become a leader by the end, until she gets chipped. But I thought that was a really cool moment of character growth. And
she also gets a dapper suit.
Yep.
She also gets a dapper suit. And I think, because it is a show which, again, we said it's all ages, but it is marketed largely towards children, there's a lot about war that they can't do or show, and they sort of talk around it a lot. And I thought that they found a really good balance with that, with Selenius, Mermista's kingdom, being occupied and destroyed, and her having an extreme... She is shattered by that. And they can't super focus on it because, again, it's for children, but they do make that a major turning point for her as a character. And I thought that they found a really good balance with making that serious while also still keeping it appropriate for the target audience.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I'll just say, I love Mermista in part because she's voiced by Vella Lovell, who has had a couple of small things, but have either of you seen Crazy Ex-Girlfriend?
Yes! Oh, she's so good on Crazy Ex-Girlfriend.
Yeah, and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is, I mean, I don't think it's in any way an intentional connection, but for me they're very connected because that's the only other show that I've seen be so real about borderline type mental illness issues, and she is phenomenal in it. And honestly, I didn't know if I wanted to watch She-Ra, and hearing that she was going to be one of the stars of it was a big part of why I wanted to watch She-Ra. So yeah, Mermista, fantastic character.
Missed chance with not having her sing, though.
Oh yeah, good point. Because we do get we get the horse singing, which is questionable. I think Seahawk sings once or twice.
Seahawk has a couple of numbers, and Scorpia has her big in the Underwater Nightclub episode. Yeah, when they were when she's dancing with Perfuma, and Perfuma's like, well, what do you like to do? And she goes, oh, I like to sing. And I was like, she's going to end up on that stage by accident, and then a single spotlight's going to come on, and she's going to be like, oh no, and she's going to have to sing a song. And I already know what's going to happen, but I'm so excited about it because that's my favorite thing. And it's exactly what happened. And I do wish that the songs on the show were better.
Yeah.
But the singers are very good. Seahawk is voiced by Jordan Fisher, who I love. We saw him in Hamilton a few years ago. He took over as Lawrence and Philip, and he, I always thought, no offense to Anthony Ramos, who's also wonderful, but I always thought that was kind of like a nothing character. He stole every scene he was in. He was you could not look away from him.
He's a Disney prince. We walked out of that oh, that's what a Disney prince looks and sounds like in real life.
And then wasn't he was a Disney prince in something, wasn't he?
Oh, he does one of the songs that's in the closing credits of Moana.
Oh yeah, but that's Maui's song, which is Maui is not a Disney prince.
Was he in the Little Mermaid live or one of the other live
I think he was
musicals?
In something live.
Or Grease or something?
Yes, he was in Grease live, and he sang my favorite song that I can't remember the name of, Magic Changes.
Oh yes, and such a good one.
He was in one of the Disney sing-alongs they've been doing since the pandemic started, and he sang Under the Sea, and it was really cute. Anyway, I love him, and I support him in everything that he does. That's
fantastic. I definitely want to see that. Yeah, I'm trying to think about other characters or other kind of big plot lines we pointed out. Becky, you were just talking about how Mermista kind of touches on some of the darker topics that you think are hard for a kids show to get into.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's also there's a war going on through this entire show, but they can't really show people being killed. So the only character who actually dies that I recall is Glimmer's mom.
Right.
And there's an implication, like, in the first few seasons,
she might not
Glimmer's
be dead.
dad, and then he comes back. But yeah, so I think it's something the show, it clearly wants to show some of the impact of war, and you can see it on some of the psyche of the characters and the conditions that they were raised in, but it also never goes to a really grimdark place, which would be completely tonally inappropriate for the show and for the target audience.
Well, what I was going to say about that is, Age first on the grimdark, I think that's part of why I got frustrated as well by the repeating Adora Glimmer fights, because it felt more grimdark than the show was supposed to be. But the main point I was going to make is, I think one of the things that I especially saw this watching like seasons 3, 4, 5 in order, it feels almost kind of like the Harry Potter books, that it kind of ages up, and like Hordak himself is scary, but is also kind of ridiculous and like not comedic, but he's like, he pratfalls, and I mean that Hordak Prime felt much scarier, and the dimensions of control that Hordak Prime has over the world, everything about season 5 felt much more intense and much scarier in a way that I was like, oh, okay. This feels like you kind of feel like the kids in the audience are ready for something a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think they did break, like, we barely see Hordak in season 1. The real central villain is Shadow Weaver, and Hordak is only shown to us in glimpses, and I feel like he's slowly unveiled to us, and then he loses that threatening aspect and sort of gets replaced with Horde Prime as the truly scary villain, and then of course he just kind of becomes, I mean, it's wrong Hordak, but like full on slapstick. But another thing that I noticed, and I think it was that article that I sent you from Tor.com or something similar, Adora looks the same throughout the show, but She-Ra looks significantly older in season 5 than she does in season 1, which I hadn't realized until I saw screenshots of the 2 seasons side by side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Glimmer it gets a glow up as well.
The haircut, yeah.
Yeah. And Catra's look evolved significantly over the course of the season, but she always looks amazing.
Well, I remember...
Again, literal fashion goals, like...
Well, and there was a point in season 1 with Catra where I remember I was watching it with my fiancée, Mary, and she said, like, she was kind of curious, like, how much of that is Catra wearing an outfit and how much of that is just the way Catra looks. And I kind of had, like, similar feelings about, like, Scorpia and stuff, and I liked being able to see Catra out of the Force Captain uniform, and you're going to see, okay, so that's what her hair looks like, actually. That's what she looks like outside of the uniform.
Yeah, like we learn in this season that her cheeks are fuzzy, which we didn't know because her hair was long before. But like, I was on another WisCon panel that I was on last year was the best superpowers for banging. And if I recall correctly, the question of whether Catra is furry all over came up.
Yes.
And I guess now we know.
I'm going to take a quick break and say that I was planning on marketing this to kids who might really like the show. So forgive me, Jess, if I edit that moment out. But
go for it.
Otherwise, totally understandable. But yeah, I'll probably leave it in because I think it was an interesting moment to be sure. Yeah, so I think that's kind of I'm trying to rack my brain if there's any kind of like one or two other last hits we wanted to make on the show. I did like just in general that Season 3 especially cuts way back on the characters we get. Seahawk doesn't appear at all. The horse doesn't appear at all. And I really liked that Season 4 and especially Season 5, they really let some of the other characters really come forward. Like, Perfuma, I think, was mostly a sort of like, she gets to say one or two cool lines and you get to have a fun power until Season 5, but she really gets to come into her own. What's the little girl who's the Ice Queen? What's it? Frosta?
Frosta.
Yeah. She gets to have a little bit more character development. Like, I really liked that it was always an ensemble show to some extent, but it really becomes much more of one in Season 5, in part because they take some of the main characters off the board for a while.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Okay, well, thank you guys both for being a part of this. You guys both put out a heck of a lot of other great content. For those who are first hearing you, I'd love for them to be able to find it. Becky, first, where can people find some of your content, especially some of your novels?
My content. My books are Bound by Blood and Sand and the sequel Freed by Flame and Storm from Delacorte Press. They came out a few years ago. And you can find me on Twitter as @allreb, ALLREB. And occasionally on Instagram. I would say also tinyletter.com/allreb. I send like an personal essay type thing about once a month. Yeah, but mostly on Twitter. Come say hi.
Awesome. And Jess, what about you?
I am also on Twitter @Jess Plummer. I have a podcast about Superman movies called Flights and Tights, and I do a lot of my writing at bookriot.com. So you can listen to me yelling about superheroes over there if you wanted more traditional superhero yelling from this episode.
I love both of your podcasts, and I think if you're first discovering them now, definitely check out both of those podcasts and their writings.
Oh shoot, I didn't actually mention my podcast.
Okay, yeah, I thought you had, but I was thinking about but why don't you talk about your podcast as well?
So my podcast is my sister and I have a podcast called Rachel and Becky Judge Things, where we watch things that we have heard about from the internet and let you know whether the internet is right or wrong about them. And we actually, when She-Ra first came out, we did an episode about She-Ra, and my sister, who does not like superheroes, actually really liked it, and it was much better than she expected. I obviously loved it and watched every season several times as soon as it came out. So, so Rachel and Becky Judge Things, which is at rachelandbeckyjudgethings.com.
Awesome. Well, great. And I'm sure I'm going to have many more reasons to get both of you on, but thank you so much for being a part of this. I'm glad we finally got to get all three of us together. And for folks who, I'm hoping that some of your own fans have followed us over here. So for anyone who hasn't, this is your first time hearing a superhero ethics podcast, please be, I also do a podcast called the Star Wars Universe Podcast, which goes pretty deep on Star Wars products. We're currently in the middle of a discussion of both the TV show The Mandalorian and the TV show The Clone Wars. Just to further confuse people on The Clone Wars, at the moment, we're doing every week, we're reviewing a couple of episodes, going through the whole show, but I've also now started a discussion just on the last season. And every day this week and into next week, we're going to be releasing an episode on that. Because we're a little bit crazy, but it's been a lot of fun and a great show. You can also find me on the Bingers Assemble podcast network doing a whole discussion of Altered Carbon, as well as all of these podcasts are part of the Stranded Panda podcast network, which is kind of really just about a whole bunch of different podcasts about geek media and by people who love geek media and love to go deep on it. So please check out all those podcasts, all those links, but especially and most importantly, the links to the stuff that Becky and Jess does. I love their podcasts and writings. Becky, I've not yet gotten to your novel, but it's on a list of things for me to try and get through this year.
It's so good.
Jacob, who I know was our former host, has raved about it. So I'm really looking forward to trying to read both of those books. So you can find, if you want to be part of the conversation, I think all three of us would love to hear more of what you have to say. Tell us what you thought of She-Ra. What were your favorite moments? What were things you didn't like? What were things that we talked about today that you either agree with or want to have your say on? You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, and email, all at Superhero Ethics, and the link to all of those will be in the show notes. So, on behalf of myself, thank you to both of you, thank you to all of you fans, and have a great day.